So we wanted to do an episode of Straight Up talking about LGBT rights, where the movement is, where it's going, and I think a place to start is a North Carolina controversy around the bathroom ban, the governor's action. One thing I wonder is it a coincidence that it's coming up now during a presidential campaign year, or was that by someone's design?
I think it's kind of a sort of culturally ripe for this sort of fight right now. It really feels a lot like the objections to same-sex marriage, and then before that to just gay men in general. It's a sort of it's a fear-mongering based on lies about predation. Once most of the country is pretty cool with same-sex marriage and getting there on just gay people in general, then we've moved on to the next boogeyman, and that's trans people. And I think largely because they are less visible.
To your question about it coming up in a presidential election, that gives a way for it to have just sort of a exponential reach. And as we have kind of the ugliest possible candidate coming up on the right side, this meshes with not only the history of gay discrimination, but of course around bathrooms itself. It very neatly figures into discrimination around bathrooms, drinking fountains, racial fears. And all this time, it's of course insane to think that there's this predator myth that's come up around gay men or queer women as well, and trans people. There's never been a case of a trans person ever assaulting someone in a bathroom, and at the same time, the former Republican Speaker of the House is
right.
Going to prison for child molestation. But yet somehow that does not map onto straight white men in any way as a group to be afraid of.
It's always been illegal to assault someone in a bathroom. It's always been illegal to sexually assault someone anywhere.
Right.
None of these things have changed. It's not about bathrooms. It's about marginalizing. It's about forcing people to the side and saying, we reject you. And the bathrooms, like you said, there's a long history of bathrooms being sort of emblematic of that.
Do you think, are you surprised at all that Obama and the administration have reacted as, one might say, as forcefully as they have, given what might assume the political risks of that must look like to someone in his position?
I don't know if I'm surprised. I guess I'm impressed by both President Obama and Loretta Lynch. Their speeches were very forthright, very uncompromising.
But this action is about a great deal more than bathrooms. This is about the dignity and the respect that we accord our fellow citizens and the laws that we as a people and as a country have enacted to protect them, indeed, to protect all of us. And it's about the founding ideals that have led this country haltingly but inexorably in the direction of fairness, inclusion, and equality for all Americans.
The laws that have been passed there are wrong and should be overturned, and they're in response to politics in part some strong emotions that are generated by people, some of whom are good people, but I just disagree with when it comes to respecting the equal rights of all people, regardless of sexual orientation.
I think, though, it's clear that President Obama is in the final year of his of being in office. We haven't seen Hillary Clinton make a clear statement about bathroom access. She said she supports the president, she supports trans people, but she has not said, and I therefore think that people should be able to use the bathroom that comports with their gender identity. She's not made an explicit statement on that. And I think that is more in keeping with what happens with politicians around election years. We saw it with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We saw it with marriage. That even, the Democrats know the LGBTQ community is going to vote for them. You would have to be pretty uninterested in having civil rights as a gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans person to vote for the Republicans. We know the Supreme Court could take away your rights very easily, such rights that you have. And so I think there's a knowledge that you need to pay lip service, you need to say the right things, but you don't have to fight, and we'll still vote for you. So in so many elections past, and it does feel like history is repeating again here.
Stories like the North Carolina bathroom ban, they tend to provoke a fair amount of absurdity in the chattering classes and maybe even among some of our colleagues in the media. I know for me, I think someone alluded to this earlier, but the idea that there have been all these predators kind of lurking in the men's rooms of our nation, and they'll now move over to the women's room, is kind of strikingly absurd. In the coverage you've digested, or not quite digested, what's leapt out at you has been particularly egregious?
The notions of gender are changing. People like me say they need to change, but it's very disruptive for people. It's challenging some of their most fundamental beliefs. And so in comments I've seen, so men can go into bathrooms, people just they simply don't understand what it means to be transgender. And so I think for me, it's more of a challenge to do more education, to be more conscious of not simply writing off, what to me seem like transphobic responses as hate or just anti-queer feelings, but more as something that we need to reach out to people and just do a better job of educating them.
One of the most famous cases about HIV criminalization was of a then young man named Nushan Williams here in New York State. I read a story about Nushan Williams that was repeating things that have been debunked for 15 years in a Buffalo newspaper now. And that made me very disheartened to think about, okay, this case came up with sort of all these racist tropes and bad ideas about HIV and predators that just simply weren't true. And here it is 19 years later, and just a little story. He's basically in prison for life. He had a 12-year sentence, but Cuomo, sex offenders in the state basically have an out that the governor can keep them in. And Cuomo's kept him in under something called civil confinement. And he's probably going to be in it for the rest of his life. I was very disappointed to see that story looking with the same language as it would have had in 1997 about HIV and race and all of it.
Wow.
The thing I noticed that I thought was pretty shameful recently was not specific to North Carolina, but it was about the sort of trans fear-mongering. And there's a writer named Ian Halpern who's writing a book about the Kardashians, and a source said that Caitlyn Jenner was thinking of detransitioning. It looked like it was one source, and then it became multiple sources without any sort of confirmation or backup. And then CBS picked it up, The Wrap picked it up, Daily Mail picked it up, Fox News. Fox News and Daily Mail, you can kind of see what their angles on it might be. The problem with this, apart from being a journalistic fail, is that it gives fodder to the idea that this is about whim or about even choice. We keep using the word choice when it comes to bathrooms. And although choice is in some ways technically accurate, I mean, it's about the same kind of choice that I make to choose the men's room. Comports with my gender identity. And it's not based on whim. It's not based on the idea that I might decide tomorrow that I'm female and that might the next day then decide that I'm male again. It just gives way too much credence to the idea that this is a passing idea.
I harbor the fear, not that I have any kind of betting interest in the presidential race because I'm an objective journalist and I just report the facts, but that Obama's support for transgender rights in North Carolina and elsewhere has the potential to be seen as harming the Democrats' chances, and if the worst possible outcome of a Trump presidency occurs, that people will look back and say, that's why. And that's happened in the past with quote-unquote social issues, where the Democrats' position on issues that were seen as out of step with mainstream America, that it costs them the White House, it costs them Congress, and then the consequence, obviously, as part of the argument is that, well, not only did you lose the race, but you lost the ability to, in fact, protect the people that you were trying to protect. Is that a danger here? Is that a danger we should even be worried about because there's a simple question of right or wrong?
That sounds like a narrative that's often pushed onto things. I mean, when Proposition 8 was voted on in California and failed. Is fail the right term? It was
enacted
right.
To the detriment of
the failure
exactly.
of progress.
Yeah, the vote was blamed on black people in California. It simply wasn't true, and yet somehow that narrative really
blamed on black people who came out to vote for Obama, which is the other part of it, right?
Yeah, and it simply wasn't true, but somehow that narrative was so juicy, was so attractive, that it were too cold with people who really should have known better. And I think, this issue is It's a classic wedge issue. It's something that's happened before with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, with same-sex marriage, where Democrats, I believe Hillary Clinton supports the right of trans people to use the bathroom, but she's a politician who needs to win an election, and she knows that the gays are going to vote for her. So should she risk the votes of people who are unenlightened about trans people's right to pee in peace?
And the people who are really paying attention will note that that Trump doesn't really have a problem with trans people either. You know, said that Caitlyn Jenner could use, you know, whichever bathroom in Trump Tower she preferred. You know, right. It's not a choice between a Ted Cruz and a perfect progressive. You know.
Yeah.
And the idea of what mainstream America is up for debate. I mean, Trump is playing to an idea of what it will be for another 20 years or so. But the white, as I did a video about this a couple weeks ago, the white majority is coming to an end in only 27 years and counting. But the Obama coalition and what Clinton, if she doesn't mess it up too much, will probably be the Clinton coalition, is probably going to be one that's pretty supportive of trans rights. I mean, if you look at this down by age, they're overwhelmingly supportive of trans rights and LGBT rights. And even Mitt Romney won more elderly white votes than even Ronald Reagan did, and he did not say as well as Richard Nixon, having overwhelming majorities in the South, but he had a pretty conservative coalition. He still didn't win. So I think that history is on the side. They're not going to be able to have these kinds of wedge issues. There'll be different ones, but they won't be able to have these kinds of wedge issues for too many more elections.
So let's talk about LGBT issues in the presidential race and focus on the Democratic side where there still is a primary contest. We can have another show about whether that's still a viable contest or not. But is there any daylight on these issues when it comes to Senator Sanders versus Secretary Clinton? Or are they broadly in sync on this, at least now?
I think they're broadly in sync. Just having looked at the platforms on their websites, Sanders is sort of short and sweet, but like, you know, a good umbrella. Clinton's is very detailed and it's sort of exhaustive, you know, and that sort of strikes me as sort of like
fitting, right? I mean, that's what you would expect.
She's the wonk, and he's the, you know, he's the go from the gut, you know, guy. So there isn't a whole lot of daylight. I do take exception to the idea that Sanders was, you know, here when Clinton was here for such a long time, because they both only very recently came out in favor of marriage equality, for example, him in 2009 and Clinton in 2011. They're both, as all national politicians of note, have been all Johnny-come-latelys. So, you know, they're both there now, and I think we should embrace them and be grateful for that. But it took them both a while, I think, because they are politicians.
Right.
I think that there's not a huge difference between them in a presidential sense. I think he's better on economics. She's much better on tactics. And thinking of how they've approached AIDS. She had that horrific, you know, Reagan praising, which gave him the best in that he's completely blown.
Yeah, that's true.
And she had a meeting last week with 20 heads of AIDS organizations. He canceled the meeting that he was supposed to have, which was just awful. I can't excuse that, even though I voted for him, and I write for a left-wing British newspaper, so I can say who I vote for. And at the same time, I think that I do believe he is better if you look sort of economic vision-wise, and the more I've studied about HIV epidemiologically, it very much ties into economics, to universal health care, to things like that, but I think he is much further along than she is. I think she has sort of wonky policy ideas about how to deal with things, but if you sort of dealt with the economy more broadly, then I think actually HIV would be in a better place.
So Donald Trump has said many things in the campaign, but I think as we've alluded to before, perhaps has been perceived as not as unfriendly to LGBT issues and to that community as some prospective Republican nominees of the past. Do we trust that that is actually where he is, given that he can be a bit, informal about his approach to policy?
I don't trust it at all. I mean, I think he'll be happily he will happily take the endorsements of a certain class of rich gay people. But he's, as we have clearly seen, he is very hostile towards Mexican LGBT people, African American LGBT people, disabled and differently abled LGBT people, immigrant LGBT people, Muslim LGBT people. So I think he's just going to be a disaster. And of course, for women overall, he's a disaster.
I think there's the perception that given that marriage equality has attained so much progress, that to some degree this community has been taken care of, might be the word.
Right.
And so I wonder for you all and how you cover it, has that been a challenge? And I wonder if that's a challenge even in addressing an audience, some of whom are themselves LGBT, because if that was your chief concern, then to some degree you are taken care of. Is this something you have to worry about and deal with in your work?
It seems that there's never any shortage of outrages to cover. And
Thank goodness.
And marriage equality didn't put an end to that. But certainly that was not an uncommon reaction that, okay, it's all good now, right? And, you know, so this, what unfortunately I think is a little bit of a silly thing to say of, yeah, you know, you can now, people can marry their same-sex partner on Saturday or Sunday, go to work on Monday, put the picture and be fired, you know, go home together and be kicked out of your home. I mean, there are very few rights. It happens that marriage is one of them, and marriage does bring lots of benefits in this country, but it is by no means, it's a nice recognition of some civil rights, but in some ways it stresses how many are still withheld.
I think that's the general reaction, and not universal, but a large part of the reaction to marriage equality has been a function of the fact that it was a pretty swift civil rights sort of, we moved the country from here to here pretty quickly, and it was very effective, and I think a lot of the country felt the sort of like build up, the crescendo, and then they feel like there's a big check mark that you say, all right, we're good, right?
Yeah.
We're not good yet. We're not good by a long stretch. So, you know, there's the fear among many LGBT nonprofits that the wealthy white gay men would pack up and go home because their main issue is solved. So in my work and for the Advocate, which has a primarily LGBT audience but also reaches other people, there's certainly a function of it that involves explaining to people these are the issues that we still have to discuss. We still have to get through. Our stories still have to be told. We still have legal inequalities in all sorts of directions. We still have socioeconomic inequalities. We still have social disparities in terms of acceptance. So yeah, that's ongoing.
What I find challenging, I'm lucky where I work, they're happy to let me write about these things. There are places I've worked before where it would be hard to keep doing, to keep reporting on it. We want to write about other inequalities. We also want to write about joy and love and life and features and sports and other things like that that are great to cover. I think from a news standpoint, it's harder though to get into the rest of the country. Like the South has been underreported in the Midwest. So that's why a place like Flint is hard to come up on the map, and these sites where all these things are happening most horrifically are in the lower South, in the middle of the country. And these issues tie in not to just LGBT discrimination, but they also very much tie into misogyny and reproductive justice. And I've been following how these STD pop-ups that are happening that tie into abstinence-only education, but they also tie into how Planned Parenthood has been unfunded in these places, and you have communities where the only place you could get contraceptives or STD protection was Planned Parenthood clinics. So once they're all gone, you have these HIV flare-ups that are happening. And that's harder, I think, to deal with because they're not on the coast, they're sort of off the radar, and it's hard to get there, and the people who are doing really important work there just have so many things working against them that it's hard to get coverage, and it's hard for the nation to see kind of what's happening there.
Do any of you ever feel a tension between being a journalist and being an advocate and covering issues like this? I mean, we all obviously, I feel those tensions in a lot of stuff I cover, but I'm wondering if you feel that and how you deal with that. Do you see them as separate things?
To me, they're interrelated. I don't feel a great tension about it. I advocate for some things that I cover, but my role as a reporter is not to be the advocate for for the issue itself.
Journalism is my advocacy work, but I'm a journalist, not an advocate, not an activist. But I do think there's an important role that has become clear, especially actually around as trans issues have become the flashpoint, the importance of empathy, of I'm not trans, and I have to admit that until quite recently I had some pretty strange ideas myself about trans people that I have sort of addressed by reading and knowing and just becoming more aware of trans issues, that my own awareness of my coming to consciousness, it helps me both kind of be a representative. For example, when we're talking about bathrooms, I believe that some people are discombobulated by the prospect of trans people in their bathroom or changing rooms. But why are we worried about these cisgender people who really have all the rights that they need, instead of worrying about the one trans person who is in that bathroom and is having all of this stuff thrust upon them, all these ideas conjured about them? Why are we not sympathizing with those people? And I think there's a role to being in a newsroom or to just writing stories that people of all persuasions and all points of view see, that is kind of empathetic with the people who are in trouble. And I think that's a useful thing for a journalist, and still be a good journalist.
So we should talk about the future of the issue and the movement, broadly speaking. And recently there's been an effort to honor kind of important landmark sites in gay rights, LGBT rights history, Stonewall, other places. I wonder if there's any danger in talking about that history when so much of the story has yet to be told. Is that something you worry about?
Oh no, I say bring up Stonewall every day, because I hate when I went to the last hearing for the Supreme Court in the morning. I think the date was April 27th of last year. And then I was in Baltimore that night for the second night of the uprising. And I had this terrible disconnect of like white-moneyed gay class politicos being like, well, we would support the Black Lives Matter movement if they weren't harming property or threatening to harm property, as if they didn't understand that this all started in a riot about police violence 40 years ago, about police brutality and police profiling. So I'm all for bringing up Stonewall and remembering exactly what it meant.
Yeah. And some of the other things that have recently been recognized, I loved just a couple of weeks ago, the house where the Furies met, which was a lesbian feminist collective in the 1970s, has been put on the National Register of Historic Places. And I called one of the women who was in the Furies and said, how do you look back on this? And well, it was very important, but we still haven't smashed the patriarchy. We still haven't won. There's still so much work to be done, but we should still recognize and remember what's come before. Because even within our own community, people tended to get information from local gay papers. You didn't necessarily know what was happening, 2 states over. And so I think even for many people who are in the community, who are very open and want to know about gay issues, there's still stuff that they don't know. So any of these efforts to, bring up these moments from history, however recent or far in the past, are nothing but positive, I think.
It's interesting that queer people aren't born into queer families.
Right.
It's not the same thing as growing up in a family with an ethnic heritage that's somehow different from the people around you. So we have to find our communities, and we have to learn what our history is. Yeah. I think these landmarks are really crucial in helping young people, especially, to see that they're part of a historical line that goes back a lot further than even Stonewall. There's a continuity and that arc to history, and that they're on it, but they're not at the start of it. Yeah. That there's a lot of important action that precedes them.
So what do you all want to see change about how this issue is covered, or about the issue itself?
I hope we get to the point where the Equality Act is a front-page news story that the country cannot avoid or shy away from, and nor can our lawmakers.
I hope that we will look at the fact that 1 in 2 Black gay men are projected to become HIV positive and muster the same creativity and politics and passion that we did to address HIV in the 80s and 90s, and also that we addressed marriage equality in the past decade.
Yeah. People often used to say back in the day, oh, I hope that we, in the feminist movement, I hope that one day we don't have to have feminist journals because women will have full equality. And we always need those journals. That is not something to wish for. And so I hope that we still have, you know, LGBTQ sections in mainstream magazines, but then instead of reporting daily and having to choose between, you know, the 5 potential stories about outrageous bills that have been introduced that would completely deny people's civil rights, that at least some of the stories, or more of the stories, are about joyful, happy things, or about informational things, about sharing stories about history, just generally a more positive, less need to kind of explain basic things to people, and have more joy in the sections.
Well, more joy. I'll drink to that.
All right.
Cheers.
Joy.
Cheers.
Clinky.